Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 236 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Who do we count as part of our family? Do we count parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, grandparents, and cousins? What if a relative was born in a foreign place and one of their parents was of a different race? Would they count as family? These are questions that 18th-century Britons asked themselves. They asked themselves these questions in Great Britain, North America, and in the Caribbean. And as we might suspect, their answers to these questions varied by time and place. So why the variation? This was a question that Daniel Livesay, an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College in California, sought to answer in his book, Children of Uncertain Fortune, Mixed-Race Jamaicans in Britain and the Atlantic Family, 1733 to 1833. Now, it was during his quest for answers that Dan was able to chart the evolution of British ideas about race. And today, he's going to share some of his findings with us. Now, as we investigate notions of race and family within the 18th and early 19th century British Atlantic world, Dan reveals details about Jamaica, where it fit within the British Empire, and why it's an ideal place to study ideas about race. How we can see ideas about race evolve by studying the lives of colonial Jamaica's elite mixed-race population. And why and how studying the Caribbean can help us better understand early North American history. But first, did you know we have t-shirts? It's true. The Omohundro Institute and I now have Ben Franklin's World t-shirts for sale in our new custom store. It's a store that also contains hoodies and tote bags, so be sure you check out all the fun at benfranklinsworld.com/shop. And if there are any items you'd like to see added to the store, just let me know. Oh, and all the t-shirts and Ben Franklin's World swag you buy raises funds to help the Omohundro Institute and I keep this podcast going. So check it out. benfranklinsworld.com/shop, and thank you for your support. And now, it's time for us to venture into the 18th century British Atlantic world so we can see just how British ideas about race and family developed. Are you ready? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College in California. His research focuses on the intersections of race, family, and slavery in North America and in the Caribbean. He's written numerous articles and a book, Children of Uncertain Fortune, Mixed-Race Jamaicans in Britain and the Atlantic Family, 1733 to 1833. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Daniel Livesay.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
You know, I think what we need is a little scene setting. In Children of Uncertain Fortune, Dan traces the lives of 360 mixed-race Jamaicans who traveled between Jamaica and the United Kingdom and then used their family, political connections, and wealth to create and take advantage of many social and political opportunities within the British Empire. Dan, the lives of the individuals you studied are really fascinating, but I wonder about Jamaica itself. Would you tell us about Jamaica, where it fit within the 18th and early 19th century British Atlantic world that you study, and what its relationship to British North America and the early United States was?
Some of your listeners might know Jamaica was a crucial epicenter for slavery in the 18th century. It was really kind of the economic crown jewel for the British Empire in the 18th century. And that's because Jamaica, like a lot of Caribbean territories, was a hotbed of sugar production. And sugar in the 17th and the 18th centuries really took off across the world. And people were putting it in their coffees and in their teas. They were making all sorts of desserts. They were using it to preserve food. And so sugar was an incredibly valuable commodity. And it really grows in a narrow band of latitude in the world. And the Caribbean is a sort of a central, important place for that. So Jamaica was a site for this. And at the time, the Europeans kind of operated under the assumption, or they at least professed to claim, that the Caribbean was too hot for Europeans to kind of do really hard labor. And so they said that, you have to have Africans who are much hardier, they claimed, farm sugar in these really sweltering conditions. And so Jamaica was both a hotbed of sugar, but also slavery. And over the course of the entire transatlantic African slave trade, it's estimated that about 1.2 million Africans were brought to this tiny little island, which is about the size of Connecticut. And so it really becomes a huge profitable center for the British Empire because all the sugar is going off to Britain. It's making huge amounts of money. Some of the wealthiest people in the entire British Empire are living in Jamaica, and they are the beneficiaries of that expropriated labor from enslaved people. And in terms of North America, sugar is obviously really important for the diets of North Americans as well. They're using sugar. They're also taking molasses, which is the byproduct of sugar production, and they're using it to distill rum. And Jamaica, along with other West Indian colonies, is also an important place for the British North Americans to send things like fish, which is used to feed enslaved people, and other commodities. So it's a really important part of the British Atlantic economic world, and it's a really crucial part of the kind of financing of that empire.
So what were the broader demographics of Jamaica like? I mean, you mentioned that we're talking about 1.2 million enslaved people living and working on an island that's roughly the size of Connecticut, but did African and African descended people make up a majority of its population?
Absolutely, yeah. So it is really a strange society. It's not like any other place in North America. If you think about the slave society as a place like Virginia or South Carolina, South Carolina has a slave majority for most of the 18th century. So the number of enslaved people outnumbers the number of free people. But there's just sort of a slight amount more of enslaved people versus free people in South Carolina. Virginia has more free people than enslaved people. But if you go to places like the West Indies, and especially to Jamaica, the demographics are completely skewed. So that there's, by about 1750, roughly 10 enslaved Black people for every free white person. So it's just this monumentally unbalanced racial society in terms of that difference between slavery and freedom. So it becomes this really sort of strange place that is making a lot of money for people. And the reason why there's so many enslaved people compared to free people is that sugar is just so profitable that planters just want to make as much money as they can. And so they try to farm every available plot of land they can with things like sugar and with coffee later on. And they don't really want to reduce the number of enslaved people that come over, except for the fact that having this big numerical difference between enslaved people and free people means that you potentially have an uprising in the making because so many people are oppressed compared to those who aren't. So for Jamaica, for most of its colonial history, it really, for at least the rulers of Jamaica, they're constantly terrified that there's going to be an uprising. And in fact, there are numerous uprisings in Jamaica. There's a really important one that in 1761 called Tacky's Revolt. And that in part comes about because there just are so many more enslaved people of color than there are free white people. So it is a very imbalanced society, at least through the 17th and the 18th centuries.
Now, what did this demographic imbalance mean for family dynamics in colonial Jamaica? And I ask because I am thinking about societies in British North America, and you do have some places like South Carolina, as you mentioned, where the number of enslaved people really outnumbered the number of free whites. So when you have conditions that are this imbalanced, you do see white men turning to African and Native American women for companionship. So I'm wondering if the same thing happened in Jamaica.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a really good way to compare what's happening in Jamaica to other places. It gives some context to what these families in Jamaica are like. And these are the families that kind of make up the bulk of what I'm writing about in the book. So if we think a little bit more about the demographics of Jamaica, there's obviously this big racial disparity between Blacks and whites. There's also a pretty big gender disparity within the white population. So Jamaica, along with the Caribbean generally in the 18th century, it's not really seen as a proper place for women, in part because the heat and because it's seen as kind of a place where people's passions can get too riled up in the heat. And because there's so many enslaved people, there's a fear about Black male sexuality and violation of white women's virtue and things like that. So a lot of women are really discouraged from going to the West Indies. It's not to say that they don't come. There's a lot of great new work coming out about how, in fact, there were a large number of white women in Jamaica. But in the 18th century, there's about 2 to 3 times as many white men as there are white women. And so there are kind of the settled families that are, of a white husband and a white wife and white children. Those do exist, and that's part of Jamaican society. But the majority of the families, if we want to use family in a really broad term, are really mixed race families. And here, I think it's important to also be really kind of specific about what we mean, because when we're talking about interracial relationships in Jamaica, we're primarily talking about ones of sexual violence, because there are a lot of white men that show up. There aren't as many white women for them to get married to. They see this very large enslaved population of women who they prey on, really. And part of that is perhaps to fill their lusts and things like that. But it's also part of the kind of terror and oppression that goes into kind of maintaining control in a slave society that's so imbalanced. And so sexual violence is a really critical part of how slavery is kept in this kind of brutal situation. So a lot of mixed race children come out of those relationships of sexual violence. And for the most part, they're not really taken care of. And the white men who are the fathers of those children certainly wouldn't call those family members, and they don't think of them in those ways. But a fair number do end up having kind of long-term relationships, either with enslaved women on their plantations or women that are on nearby plantations. Thomas Thistlewood is a sort of famous character that a lot of people write about. Trevor Bernard has written a lot about him. He was this very sadistic slave owner and slave overseer in Jamaica. And he has this really brutal diary that he writes about these horrible cases of terrorizing and beating and sexually violating a lot of women on the plantation. But he nevertheless has a kind of long-term relationship with one enslaved woman named Phoeba. And their relationship kind of shows that even in this very strange, extremely violent society, there are these kind of quasi-normative sexual relationships that go on. I would not call them consensual, because I don't think you can really have a consensual relationship in which one person is enslaved and one person is free in such a racially oppressed society. But nevertheless, these relationships do exist. And some rough estimates, we kind of look at the manumission rates in Jamaica. About 20% of the children of mixed race relationships end up getting freed by their fathers. And so it wasn't entirely unusual for white men to look at their mixed race children and have some affection for them and believe that they needed some kind of protection. So you get a lot of men who actually freed those children. And then what I write about in this book is those who kind of go even beyond just that, taking basic protection of those children, where they actually educate them off in Britain, or they send them across the Atlantic Ocean to undertake a trade. And that's really quite different from what you see in North America. And part of the reason for that is that North America is seen as a site where white family networks are incredibly strong. There's much more white female migration to North America than there is in the Caribbean. And so in some ways, the North American colonists are trying to recreate that kind of free domestic model of family relationships that they were bringing with them from Europe. So when you have white men who have sexual relationships with enslaved women, which happened incredibly frequently in North America as well, it's not seen as kind of part of the society in the way that it is in Jamaica. Again, because in a place like Jamaica, it's just seen as kind of usual or typical, in part because there just aren't a lot of options for white men outside of relationships with women of color. But if you look at a place like Virginia or South Carolina, those mixed race relationships are much more prohibited in terms of their social standing, and they're kind of excoriated in the press. If you think about Thomas Jefferson and his relationship with Sally Hemings, that's seen as kind of traversing the bonds of propriety, because this is a place where white settled families are supposed to live. So Jamaica really is quite different from North America in terms of the degree to which a mixed race family can be seen as a family. In North America, they aren't really seen as families. They're seen as kind of outside of the bonds of tradition.
Do you think it was just traditions of family that allowed Jamaica to turn out so differently from British North America, at least in how each society viewed mixed race people and families?
Yeah, I think part of it is because of that family aspect where, North America is just seen as kind of reconstituting an old world example, whereas a place like the Caribbean, it's just seen as a wildly different place. It's not really seen as a place that's going to recreate the same kind of institutions and the same kinds of structures as England or France or Spain. And so it kind of operates as this strange dystopian place where really the emphasis is on profit. It's on making as much money as possible. And it's on kind of turning an eye away from exploitation that's going on that really wouldn't be countenanced anywhere else. So I think it's seen kind of as an exceptional place, whereas British North America is a little more in between. It's not quite as exceptional compared to these old world standards. So in Jamaica, I think that there's a lot more experimentation in some ways that's going on in terms of ideas about race. And again, this is something that the book gets into and that we can probably get back to in a second, which is that I think that in Jamaica, because there is such a lopsided racial demography, they have to be really creative with how they think about what race means. What does whiteness mean? What does blackness mean? What does family mean? Because they can't just depend upon what was happening in England. Things are just so radically different in the tropics compared to the old world. And they can't even really sort of model themselves after British North America. And this is something that I think historians have known for a long time. Winthrop Jordan wrote a lot about this, almost half a century ago, in the ways that just those demographic differences where you have such a large enslaved population, that really does create incredible transformations in terms of the social and cultural components of those societies.
It's really interesting to me that you noted that North Americans were really trying to set up the old world example of Great Britain in North America. And I'm really struck by this comparison because I kind of see it. For example, when South Carolina's population shifted to being a slave majority population, South Carolina really became concerned about race and the possibilities of a slave uprising. And you wrote in Children of Uncertain Fortune that you similarly see British legislators in London having a likewise concern about the growing Black and slave majority population of Jamaica. So I wonder, why do you think these old world legislators or these would-be old world legislators are so concerned about New World places like Jamaica and the racial demographics?
Yeah, and it's not only just the legislators in Britain and Westminster who are kind of looking toward the West with some concern, but it's also rulers in Jamaica itself who are pretty nervous about what's happening in terms of the demography. Again, that imbalance between Africans and Europeans just really seems to herald some potential insurrections in the future. So what happens is that from the British standpoint, they want to see a very stable society in the West Indies. And a stable society to them is one in which there's a kind of reproducing white population that can have militia members who can keep everything in check and can kind of keep the society stable, who can make sure that if there is some sort of whispering among enslaved people, that it can be put down by a sort of hardy, settled population that is working toward the stability of that slave society. So they really want to see primarily families settled there, but also just kind of a stable settler core of free people. And early on, from the British standpoint, they really aren't thinking too much about the racial element of that. A lot of kind of people in London and Westminster are saying, it wouldn't be that bad of a thing if there were mixed race people who were free, who could be part of that society that was trying to make sure that the enslaved people stayed enslaved. So they're not thinking too much about the racial element of who constitutes an appropriate free settled society. And in the early years in Jamaica, I kind of argue that there's some similar considerations about using free people of color. But primarily, Jamaican officials just want to thread this or kind of navigate this tricky balance of, again, making as much money as possible, which means importing as many enslaved people as they can, but also not having the balance tip so far in one direction that they're going to risk having an uprising that they can't put down themselves. So they have to undertake a lot of half measures. They do undertake a lot of half measures, I should say, to try to deal with that. So they have things like the deficiency fines, which I talk about. And deficiency fines are basically laws that are put into place to try to make sure that every white plantation owner or business owner employs a set number of white people on their plantation. And this is passed to try to make sure that there's some amount of white growth in that society and that there are kind of people outside of just the plantation owners who will be willing to defend that society in case there is an enslaved uprising. Those deficiency fines don't really go anywhere, to be honest, though. And eventually they're seen as like sort of a tax that everyone has to pay because no one really wants to pay to bring over indentured servants because they're too expensive and they're not really seen as good workers. So they try instead to encourage family members to come over. There's a number of governors that try to recruit family members to come over. Those don't really work either. And so what my book kind of gets at, where the action really starts in my book, is this period of time in the 1730s when the legislators in Jamaica kind of try a radical experiment. And they do this in the midst of a kind of big but sort of long-term uprising by what are called the Maroons. And the Maroons are these individuals who were chiefly composed of formerly enslaved people that ran away into the mountainous interior of Jamaica. If you've ever been to Jamaica, you have really massive mountains and it's very easy to hide away. And so a lot of enslaved people actually form this kind of autonomous core in the mountains of Jamaica. And they're constantly hassling plantation owners and they're causing war and engaging in war all the time. And so, Jamaican rulers really believe that they have to do something to try to deal with the fact that they're threatened with this maroon insurgency, which is kind of always ongoing. And they're also concerned about the slaves on their plantation rising up as well. So they undertake this process of trying to make a settler core, which is not just composed of people with 100% European ancestry, but with some degree of mixed race ancestry. And so they pass a law in 1733 that says that if you're more than 3 generations removed from an African, you are now legally white. You're not sort of partially white. You're not kind of sort of white. You are white according to the laws, and you're entitled to all the same rights as any white person. And so it kind of ends this idea of a kind of one-drop rule of racial descent in Jamaica, unlike in North America, where if you have any amount of black blood, you're considered black for most of the British colonies in North America. And this becomes a really interesting period of time where Jamaicans are starting to experiment with this idea of how you might navigate these racial relationships by enfranchising a sort of small group of free people of color who might join forces with whites to create a kind of stable settler core. And again, there's a lot more I could talk about with that, but that's sort of where a lot of the legislation really gets at with this project.
That's really interesting. And we know that there are sometimes disparities between the laws that colonies passed and observed and the laws that Parliament passed and observed. So I wonder, in the families you studied, the ones who interacted with Great Britain fairly regularly, either because they had family in Britain or kids in UK schools, was it possible for you to see, through these families, whether Great Britain recognized this 3 generations and your white rule that Jamaica established?
For those that go off to Britain, so the children that I look at and the sort of young adults that I look at, they're part of this really elite core who are, in some cases, several generations removed from an African, although they're not so far removed that they're considered white. Some of them are only, 1 generation removed from an African ancestor. But their parents, both their fathers and their mothers, send them off to Britain because they don't really have a lot of options in the colonies. There are a lot of laws against free people of color in terms of their employment, in terms of their ability to vote, in terms of their ability to hold office. And so it's very tough for a lot of them to kind of make their way in Jamaica because there's just a lot of laws that get passed over the course of the 18th century, which knock them out of civil society. So a lot of them get sent off because they're just trying to avoid that racial prejudice. A lot get sent off because there aren't many schools in Jamaica either. Again, because it's such a wealth-focused island, a lot of legislators are not really thinking about education because that just is kind of a frivolity that's taking away from the wealth of a sugar plantation. So a lot go off to be educated. And then others go off to maybe apprentice, to learn a trade, and to maybe come back to Jamaica at a later point with some skills. And when they get to Britain, they aren't really faced with the Jamaican laws anymore. That gets kind of complex, and so I can kind of break that down a little bit. But when they arrive in Britain, they're really kind of operating under British laws. And if they are sort of phenotypically white enough, they can pass, so to speak, as white, and people don't really question them. But nevertheless, because so much of their wealth, because they're the children of these very wealthy sugar merchants and slave traders, because so much of their wealth is lodged back in Jamaica, they still are tied to the kind of race-based laws that exist back in the Caribbean. And one of the chapters that I have in this book looks at inheritance contests between mixed race people that go over to Britain and their white relatives who use Caribbean legislation in order to try to take them out of their inheritance. So the biggest case that I look at is of the Morse family. And the Morse family come from a very elite background. Their father is a very wealthy slave merchant and slave owner, and their mother is a very elite woman of color. She had a lot of money herself. And each of the children get sent off to Britain. They're raised in Britain. They have very elite lives. No one seems to really register that they're Jamaican. It doesn't really come up in any of the early correspondence. But nevertheless, because they are mixed race, they suffer under certain laws. And one of the laws that they suffer under is a law that's passed in 1761 that says that anyone who is mixed race and illegitimate, which they are, can only inherit £2,000 from a will. Now, £2,000 is a fair amount of money. You could live pretty comfortably on that. But their father's estate was worth £120,000. And so they were due to receive much more than just that £2,000 amount. So they're in Britain, their father dies, and almost immediately, one of their white cousins sues them in both the English Chancery Court and the Jamaican Chancery Court, saying that they should not inherit this full amount because there's this law that was passed that prohibits how much money they can inherit. They can only inherit £2,000. And so suddenly they're having to go into an English court and they're having to talk about their racial ancestry and they're having to talk about how many generations they're removed from an African ancestor. And this is where these people who had really kind of lived unencumbered by their West Indian past suddenly had to deal with the legacy of the legislation that had been passed in Jamaica. So in some ways, when people leave for Britain, they can kind of escape some of the most immediate laws that affect them that were passed by Jamaica against people of color. But at the same time, they're still tied to a lot of the legislation that goes back to the West Indies. So they're never fully divorced from that West Indian past.
I'm curious about opportunities because you noted that there were these cases where wealthy white fathers sent their mixed-race Caribbean children to Great Britain for better opportunities. But what happened to those who stayed in Jamaica? Do you have any examples that you could share of a mixed-race person who might have had a similar wealth status to the Morse family, but for whatever reason decided to stay in Jamaica?
Yeah, so for a lot of mixed-race people, if they're going to stay in Jamaica, they tend to, if they're men, probably start their own plantations, which are not going to be sugar plantations. They're going to be coffee plantations. And part of that is because coffee plantations don't require as much money as sugar plantations. And because there's that inheritance cap that I mentioned, that 1761 inheritance cap, that really does kind of prevent a lot of mixed race children from inheriting much money, at least the kind of money they would need to become very prosperous sugar planters. So for a lot of the men, what they end up doing is they can become either tradesmen, maybe have a very small sugar plantation, or by the end of the 18th century, they start to go into coffee plantations, which become pretty profitable for people of color. For elite women of color, it's a sort of different story. And what a lot of them end up doing sort of sadly is that they have to kind of join themselves to another white man who might become their companion, who they might have children with. And that becomes in some ways what's seen, at least stereotypically by a lot of observers, as being the option for elite women of color, is just to become sort of the paramour of one of the white men who lives in Jamaica, because they don't often have the options to run their own plantations. There are exceptions to this. There are women that do have their own businesses that can be successful in towns like Kingston and Spanish Town and Port Royal. Others of them do end up becoming kind of almost like attorneys for their white companions, where they will sometimes run the plantation. There's one named Mary Rose who does this in the middle of the 18th century while her white companion is off in Britain. So there are some options for women to undertake certain businesses. But for the elite women of color, really what a lot of them are angling for is some kind of relationship with a white man that can kind of keep them protected by his sort of status in white society, but also by his growing finances as well.
Opportunities varied by gender. And I guess that shouldn't be at all surprising because that was pretty much the status quo across the 18th century Atlantic world. But I do wonder if gender specifically played a role in a mixed race person's decision on whether to go to Great Britain to seek opportunities or whether to remain in Jamaica.
It absolutely did. And that's a great question. There's a few ways that we can kind of look at the numerical migration of these people. It's kind of hard because a lot of individuals don't want to list their racial designation. And it's just hard in some ways to kind of find these people. In some archives, you can find them regularly. In others, they're just sort of hidden. But if you look at sort of wills that are lodged in Jamaica in the 18th and early 19th centuries, you can look and see how often white men were giving a certain amount of money to a child of mixed race to go off to Britain who might already be there. And if we look at that group, about 2/3 of the children that are sent off to Britain are boys or young men, and 1/3 are girls or young women. And so there's obviously a big gender difference between the two. And not to kind of repeat myself, but part of this has to do with the fact that women were seen as having the option of using sexual labor in the colonies as their future. And so it was seen as less important in some ways for them to be sent off to Britain because, well, they could just find a white man to settle down with. That person would take care of them. They could get some money from that person. And so they didn't really have to, have a very elite education or train in a certain skill. But for young men, Jamaica was not really a great place if you were a person of color. And again, as I mentioned, there were a number of laws passed in the early 18th century which limited the number of jobs that they could train for. And also because of things like the inheritance cap, they don't have the same abilities to rise up through the ranks. So Britain is a pretty attractive place for young men because they go off, they can go to very elite schools, they can either stay in Britain without elite education and kind of live as very elite cosmopolitans, or they could come back and use that to become small-scale planters, or they could sometimes serve in the law. That was sort of rare. But a lot of men could also go over and train in certain professions. They could then use Britain as a kind of jumping off point for other locations. So if we think back to the Morse family that I mentioned earlier, Robert Morse, who's the sort of second oldest son in that family, he ends up going off to India after he trains as a lawyer in Britain. He makes a lot of money in India. It's a good place to make money in the 18th century. And then he goes back to Britain with kind of these two pockets of money, one from his father in Jamaica and the other from his own exploits in India. And so in some ways, this migration from Jamaica to Britain was much more of one geared towards men because of the professional side of things than it was for women. At the same time, though, women did go over in part because there was the belief that they could find a husband in Britain, they could settle and marry there. In some cases, they would come back with just a very elite education that would make them perhaps good kind of partners for white men once they returned. So it wasn't entirely closed off to women, but was much more geared towards young men and boys.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like mixed race men had a lot more opportunities in Great Britain than they would have had in Jamaica. And it also sounds like, at least to a certain extent, that British society accepted them, at least legally. But I do wonder what happened to these mixed-raced individuals socially. And that's what I'd like for us to explore after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. I know we're not done speaking with Dan yet, but I do think you can tell that his research on the hundreds of Jamaican children fathered by British men really does give us a new, expanded portrait of 18th and early 19th century family dynamics. Did you know that Dan mined birth records, estate documents, and court records, all to be able to tell us what happened when these children crossed the Atlantic and met their British relatives? As you can imagine, research like Dan's takes a really long time to do. Plus, putting all that information he found into historical context and then crafting a book from it all takes even longer. It also takes a team. And that's what the Omohundro Institute provided Dan, a team of editors and scholars dedicated to helping him write the best book he could. As an OI postdoctoral fellow, Dan spent 2 years at the Omohundro Institute honing his work. And now, thanks to the OI and their publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, you can enjoy the fruits of this team effort at a 40% discount. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/children and use promo code 01BFW. That's right, you'll receive a full 40% off the cover price of Dan Livesay's book when you visit benfranklinsworld.com/children and use promo code 01BFW. So Dan, what was the social reality for these mixed-race Jamaicans and West Indians? When they showed up in London and other places in the United Kingdom, did Britons accept them as fellow Britons?
Yeah, it really depends on each person. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies of every person's biography. But at the same time, there are some patterns that exist. And, this book has a change over time argument. And one of the arguments that I'm making is that in the middle to slightly later part of the 18th century, when you look at the correspondence of family members in Britain who are taking in these mixed race relatives, they're pretty accepting in the sort of 1750s, 60s, and 70s, even into the 1780s, of these mixed race relatives. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, part of it is because ideas about race are still a little bit uncertain in this period of time. And so Britons don't necessarily have very strong immediate reactions to what it means to have some African ancestry. Part of it has to do with the fact that family belonging in the middle of the 18th century is a little bit porous as well. And what the idea of a family is can be a little bit kind of broader than what it becomes by the 19th century. So there's a lot of acceptance. And if you look at, there's an example of a young man named Thomas Marsh who comes over from Jamaica, and his relatives there are initially kind of reticent to want to accept him because they're just not convinced that he is actually a relative of theirs. A naval officer had claimed that he was the son of their brother. And they say, well, it could be, but we're not really sure if that's the case. But then the young boy arrives in England. They look at him, they immediately see their brother's likeness, and they say, okay, well, absolutely, we'll take care of this young man. And there's only very, very brief commentary about his ethnic background, and it's very kind of hidden in certain ways. So they're not really thinking much or as explicitly about the kind of racial component of this. And it seems like a lot of families are pretty open and accepting. That's not the case for every single family member. There's another young woman I look at in 1780 named Peggy Kerr, who arrives during the American Revolution in Scotland. And her Scottish family immediately just does not want to have anything to do with her. And she kind of shuffles from one house to the next. And each one of them is just really kind of horrified by her. And they call her a Cretan and an Indian and all sorts of kind of racially targeted things. But again, in this early period, there's more of an acceptance of them. And it's also because a lot of them come with huge fortunes behind them. And so that can kind of assuage any sort of reticence that they have about incorporating these mixed race relatives. But what I argue is that by the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, you start to see more and more of a pattern of family members starting to push back and starting to kind of explicitly make commentary about their relatives' ethnic backgrounds. So one of the big families that I look at are the Taylor families. And the Taylor family, the father of these children, he comes from Scotland. He goes to Jamaica. He has 4 mixed-race children with an enslaved woman. He frees those children, and then he sends them off to live first with his family in Scotland and then to go off into a boarding school in England. And they get sent over in the 1790s. And this is a sort of a period of time in which racial ideas are starting to come out a lot. But by the 1790s, there's more and more of a concern about race. And so you see family members actually bringing up their racial background quite a bit. And so these children's uncle who live in London, he's the one that's put in charge of trying to find a school for them and trying to kind of make sure they get incorporated into the British family. And he's regularly talking about their ethnic background and saying things like, well, even though they're Black, I still think that they deserve some amount of affection. So you start to see families pushing back a little bit. And then by the early 19th century, families are just out and out not accepting these relatives into their homes. So I detail 2 individuals toward the end of the book, Robert Wedderburn and William Davidson. And these are 2 men who come from pretty elite backgrounds in Jamaica as well. They arrive in Britain hoping to kind of be successful like their peers had done for the previous few generations. And their families just don't want to have anything to do with them. And they don't let them into their homes. They openly say that we don't believe that you're actually related to us. And because of that, these 2 men really struggle in Britain. And they end up both kind of becoming paupers, both turn towards radical politics. One of them gets executed for trying to kill the prince. So they really have a very, very different experience. And part of it, as I argue in the book, is because by the early 19th century, notions of race and family are constricting to such a degree that these mixed race relatives are no longer seen as proper members of the family.
Now, what about the abolition movement? You make the case in Children of Uncertain Fortune that there was a growing movement to abolish slavery in the slave trade within Great Britain, and that this movement played a role in how mixed race people were accepted and viewed by their British families and society. So would you tell us something about this English abolition movement and how you think it impacted the experiences of the different people you studied?
Yeah, so abolitionism, which is the movement to abolish the slave trade, it's kind of a big force in the middle of the chronology of the book, but also just in the book generally. And what happens is that after the American Revolution, Britain has to kind of face the reality of what its empire is. And there's a great book by Christopher Brown called Moral Capital, which says that the American Revolution was really crucial in having Britons rethink the virtue of their empire. And, they sort of think, well, what happened? How did we have things go so wrong that our colonists wanted to separate from us? And so they start to interrogate all these different aspects of the way that the empire is run. And the slave trade comes up as one of these issues that is perhaps not virtuous at all and is in fact a kind of a blemish on the empire generally. And so a lot of people start to push back against the idea that the slave trade is moral and that it should be carried on. In addition to that, there are just kind of regular slave uprisings throughout the end of the 18th century, which kind of convince a lot of others that the slave trade is not really virtuous because people are pushing back so readily against slavery. So what's important about this period of the movement to abolish the slave trade is that it becomes this massive popular phenomenon across the Atlantic world, and especially in Britain, people get really, really interested in slavery. And because of that, they get really, really interested in questions of race. And this is what I would kind of argue, and what others have argued, is a really kind of crucible of discussions about race, because people are trying to figure out, well, if we abolish the slave trade, what does that mean about the future of our colonies? Do we abolish the slave trade because people of African descent are human just like us? Do people of African descent, will they be good free workers if we eventually emancipate our enslaved populations? So a lot of discussion around what race means comes to the fore, and it becomes a really big popular phenomenon. So because of that, there's a lot of just discussion about who people of African descent are. And for mixed race people, they become, in some ways, the most subtle examples of what race might mean. And so there's a very strong interest in who mixed race people are and the degree to which they're different from Africans or they're different from Europeans, the degree to which they could be accepted as family members or not accepted, the degree to which they make either good slaves or bad slaves. Again, there's this belief that only those of African blood can work really heavy labor in the tropics. And so if you have mixed race people, will they be bad workers if they stay enslaved? So abolitionism as this big popular political phenomenon, it doesn't just affect society on this question of whether or not the slave trade should continue, but it also affects society in the ways that people talk about what race is and what race means. So for a lot of the families that I look at in this study who are connected to the slave trade, again, if we think about John Taylor, who I just mentioned, he's a slave trader in Kingston. And so when the abolitionist debate comes up, his family members are very, very interested in the terms of that debate because it directly affects their family's bottom line and it affects their extended relatives' ability to kind of support themselves. So they become really conversant in these issues of abolitionism. And because of that, they become more and more cognizant of these subtleties and these gradations around race, and they start to think more and more about race. And so it begins this process of having individuals talk about what race means and to start to interrogate what the faces of their mixed race relatives means in terms of their either belonging to society or not belonging to society. So I think it's a really crucial moment in time for these mixed race migrants because suddenly being mixed race, it's connecting them to this big popular phenomenon of anti-slavery agitation.
It's curious that you noted that it was after the American Revolution that Great Britain started to take stock of what it meant to be mixed race, what it meant to be African, and really, at least it sounds like, what it meant to be British. And I wonder, what was it about the revolution that prompted Great Britain and Britons to take stock of all these ideas and identities?
The American Revolution is really crucial for a number of reasons. And so one, to get back to that moral argument that I was talking about, it does cause a lot of both politicians, but also just everyday Britons to wonder what's happening to our empire that people are wanting to push away from it. Is it not as virtuous as it should be? And so they start to look at all areas of the empire and they start to look at reform and they start to wonder, are there places where we can actually be better stewards of the empire? So the slave trade, which had for a long time been seen as a kind of dark, but for at least economists, necessary part of the British financial system, they start to see that as an area perhaps of low-hanging fruit to revise and to refine. And that perhaps wouldn't have come about as quickly if the American Revolution had not caused this crisis of identity in the empire. It also becomes a big issue financially. So in the immediate months after the American Revolution is over, you see this breakdown in the trade between the West Indies and North America. And so, Jamaica was really dependent upon North American markets to send things like molasses and rum and sugar to. And so in the immediate months and years after the Peace of Paris, when that trade is forbidden, it becomes a big problem for West Indians. And so it starts to create a lot of economic turbulence for the West Indians, which in turn makes people wonder whether or not the slave trade should continue on. And then there's also this issue that when the North Americans rebel and they leave, West Indians have fewer co-advocates in London to try to make their case. Before 1776, there were 26 American colonies who all kind of banded together to a degree to lobby for their rights in Britain. And now suddenly there are only 13 of them. And so it weakens the strength of the West Indians to be able to advocate for their own positions. So the American Revolution has these very, very direct impacts on the conception about what slavery is. And in some ways, the strength of slavery in the West Indies going forward. So because of all that, we get these debates around what race is, what slavery is, and it kind of amplifies these concerns that have been around for a long time, but really become crucial by the 1780s and the 1790s.
You know, speaking of trade relationships between Jamaica and North America, we know that trading partners often traded more than just goods and services, that they often traded ideas too. And Barney's really curious about this trade. He wonders whether any of the experiences of Jamaica and its ideas about mixed race people ever made their way into North American ports.
There is to a degree. And, there's a lot of family connections between North America and Jamaica. And there are people that are going back and forth between places like Rhode Island and Kingston. There are a lot of loyalists who, after the American Revolution, go down to Jamaica to restart their plantations. Again, to bring up John Taylor once more. Taylor, even though he was Scottish, he had spent a number of years in North America during the Revolution trying to become a successful merchant. Once the Revolution is over, he realizes he can't stay there. And so he goes down to Jamaica to try his hand at slave trading. And so there are a lot of family connections between the Caribbean and North America. And so a lot of ideas get traded back and forth because of that. I think, though, the West Indies as a region become almost more important than just the island of Jamaica itself. And the West Indies really become, after the American Revolution, sort of this counterpoint of what North America is trying to avoid in certain ways. There's a concern that there's such a large African presence in the West Indies that North Americans have to avoid having that kind of demographic reality on their shores. Otherwise, it's going to create, what in their minds, a kind of degradation of the civil society that they treasure so much in North America. And then perhaps almost more importantly than all of that is this big momentous event in 1791, which is the Haitian Revolution, which occurs just 100 miles east of Jamaica, where enslaved individuals in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rise up and over the course of the next 13 years, eventually throw off the shackles of slavery and colonization, and they become the first independent Black republic. And that absolutely terrorizes many free people across the Americas who are worried that this similar kind of slave insurrection is going to transpire in North America. And so you get the sort of the perceived rebellion of Gabriel in Virginia. You get a lot of Haitian migrants into places like Philadelphia and New Orleans, which sows a lot of concern that they're going to bring with them certain ideas of revolution. So in North America, the West Indies really become this foil to them, where they're just concerned that if they don't watch themselves, they don't check the slave interest to some degree, they're going to become like the West Indies, which in their mind is not a good future for them.
Dan, most of our conversation has explored the wider British Atlantic world outside of the North American mainland. And I wonder, why do you think it's important for us to occasionally shift our gaze to the Caribbean and into this wider Atlantic world? How do you think this shift can help us better understand the early American past?
Well, I think it's important because, one, these were really integrated spaces. And even though North America seems so different from the West Indies, they were incredibly linked in terms of their economies, in terms of their attitudes in certain ways. And so the people that moved back and forth between those places, they shared those ideas. They were incredibly dependent upon one another in terms of their finances. It really was a global space, and global ideas circulated pretty broadly. And as I was just talking about, I think one of the important things when you're talking about the West Indies in the 18th and early 19th centuries, as a comparison to British North America and what becomes the United States, is that as much as they're kind of integrated in certain economic and cultural ways, they're also very distinct places that nevertheless are part of the same imperial system or the same kind of Atlantic system. And so for the United States and for the British colonies that preceded it, the West Indies become a sort of comparative place that inform the ways that they think about themselves. So Benjamin Franklin, when he's trying to formulate ideas in the 1750s about what are these sort of mainland American colonies about, he's oftentimes kind of comparing the mainland to the Caribbean to sort of say, well, we're different from that location. We're a place that does recreate the old world European values. We're unlike those kind of enslaved locations that are so degraded by an African presence. And so the West Indies become this counterpoint to North America that I think very much informs the way British North Americans and sort of the early Republicans think about themselves and trying to navigate themselves away from in those early years.
Now let's go into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the American Revolution had never happened? If the Revolution had not sent Black loyalists out into the broader British Atlantic world, how would British conceptions of race and identity have evolved differently?
That's such a fun question. But I do think that it would have had a huge impact on the way Britons thought about their empire, the ways that they thought about even the sort of the face of their society. So one of the things that my book looks at is this kind of growing concern by the end of the 18th century about the presence of people of color in Britain. And there's especially a concern that, well, is Britain going to become a sort of race of mulattoes like the Jamaicans? Because there are a fair number of people of color, both from Black loyalists who show up in the 1780s, but also from sort of the many thousands of enslaved servants who have been brought over the previous 2 centuries and who had formed communities of color in places like London and Bristol and Liverpool and Glasgow and other places. And so I think that the American Revolution would have absolutely kind of reduced some of the concern about the migration of those people of color. It would have, I think, made the slave interest in the West Indies much stronger. I think it would have prevented abolitionism from happening as soon as it did in terms of the end of the slave trade. And I think it could have created a situation in which the Civil War, had the American colonies still been tied to Britain, I think that legacy of slavery could have been much deeper and much longer in not only North America, but also the Americas generally, probably into the late 19th century, and would have been similar, I think, perhaps to a place like Cuba or Brazil. So I think it really had a tremendous impact on the conceptions of slavery. I think it had a tremendous impact on the conceptions of race, and it would have had a momentous impact on both of those for the coming centuries.
So Dan, as your research focuses on the intersections of race, family, and slavery in North America and the Caribbean, we wonder which or what intersections will you be exploring now?
I'm working on a kind of a different project, which came a little bit out of this book. When I was finishing up my research for this book, I was looking through some of these pro and anti-slavery activist writings. And one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is I kept noticing that a lot of pro-slavery writers were defending the institution of slavery by saying, well, it can't be that bad because I have a slave on my plantation who's 150 years old. And if they were that old, then, how could this be a bad institution? I must obviously take care of my enslaved workers. And I kept finding this claim of these very, very old enslaved people on people's plantations. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I wonder why they're doing that. And then I had another thought of well, I don't actually know what happens to enslaved people when they become very old. And so that got me started on this new project where I'm looking at what the end of life is like for enslaved people when they reach very advanced age. And I'm making a comparison between Virginia and Jamaica. And the reason for that is that Virginia has a much healthier enslaved population, in part because it's further north. And so mosquito-borne illnesses are not as prevalent in Virginia. The tobacco regime is a little bit less destructive to people's bodies compared to sugar. And so Virginia has a much larger old population amongst its enslaved workers. Jamaica does have elderly slaves, but they're not as numerous as those in Virginia. And so I'm kind of looking at two things. One, I'm looking at what actually happens to enslaved people at that very old stage of life, what transforms for them in terms of their place in the social hierarchy, what do their jobs look like when they're old, how are they treated as elders on these plantations. And then the second half of this is, how does their presence inform the kind of defense and the discussion around slavery? And so I get into those issues around the trotting out of these very elderly African Americans as claims that slavery is in fact a very benevolent institution. There's a sort of famous case of P.T. Barnum, where his very first human sideshow was this woman named Joyce Heth, who he claimed was 160 years old and had been George Washington's nurse. And he takes her around and she becomes this very big sensation. And she's one of many people who becomes paraded around as evidence that slavery is in fact a benevolent institution. And I think the reason why all this is important is that I'm trying to answer why the book Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes such a momentous force in 1852 when it's published. And one of the things that I'm arguing is that it kind of subverts this long-held discussion that, in fact, elderly people were treated very, very kindly. Uncle Tom's Cabin sort of shows how brutal it could be for elderly people. So it's really an examination of life for those of advanced age on plantations, but also how important they were in the discussion of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries.
And where is the best place to contact you, Dan, if we have more questions about your work?
Well, you could look me up on my faculty page at Claremont McKenna College, and that's probably the easiest way to do it. And my email is up on there, and that's probably the easiest way to get in contact.
Daniel Livesay, thank you so much for speaking with us today and for helping us explore the history of mixed race people in the 18th century British Atlantic world.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
British ideas about race and family changed over time and varied by place. The British Atlantic world was a place full of families, and nearly everyone with inter-imperial family ties expected their Atlantic world kin to be a bit different. But just how different they considered them to be changed over time. For example, prior to the late 18th century, families like the Morrises and the Taylors were largely able to send their Jamaican-born mixed-race children to the United Kingdom, all with the expectation that their British relatives would take these children in, see to their education, and care for them as family. But over time, those expectations changed. As Dan related, the Morris family became involved in a bitter lawsuit where white British relatives claimed the mixed-race Morris children as family, only so that they could file a lawsuit to argue that, based upon prevailing ideas about race, those children were not entitled to the family's fortune. Rather, the fortune should go to the white British relatives, and so they stood to inherit the family's £120,000 estate. Likewise, families who had once accepted mixed-race relatives as family members began to deny these relationships during the late 1790s and early 19th century, just as questions about the virtuousness and morality of slavery in the slave trade heated up around the empire. Now, as Britons questioned and developed ideas about race and slavery, their ideas circulated around the Atlantic largely through family and trade networks, which is a big reason why people in North America paid so close attention to what was going on in the United Kingdom and the Caribbean, and why people in the Caribbean followed the happenings in North America and England. Their family members were giving them this news. So we see that the British Atlantic world was an integrated place, linked by economies, ideas, attitudes, and families. In fact, North Americans seemed to take an avid interest in the Caribbean just as it developed its practices of slavery and its ideas about race. In turn, Americans then used these Caribbean practices to develop their own ideas about slavery and race. So, as Dan related, if we really want to understand early North America and how it developed, then we need to investigate and develop an understanding of the context it existed in. And part of that context, a large part of that context, was its membership in the Atlantic world and the relationships it formed with the Caribbean. Look for more information about Dan, his book, Children of Uncertain Fortune, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/236. If you really enjoyed our conversation today and you'd like to explore Dan's work further, remember that the Omohundro Institute is offering you the opportunity to purchase a copy of Dan's book at a 40% discount. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/children and use promo code 01BFW. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our awesome theme music. Finally, Dan noted that early North Americans used Caribbean places to help them to define who they were. Do you think that we still use other nations and places to help us define who we are? If so, which nations and places do you think we use? I think this is a really interesting thought and one that's going to lead to many interesting answers. So please share your ideas with me. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.